Okay, welcome back, folks. Everybody gets 5 full stars for being here on time, coming back early. It was all great. Thank you so much. And thank you to our witness. She was able to be here. You were here a little bit early, and that's great. So you're going to all get used to introducing yourselves multiple times a day. Okay. So for the first time a witness is here in our committee, we always introduce ourselves. And for the people around the room, you're going to get a chance to introduce yourselves again. So Teresa Wood from Waterbury, and I also serve Bolton, Buell Score, and Huntington. This way this time? I think so. It might be this time. Yeah.
Doesn't matter.
I don't know. I try to be alternating. Go
That
ahead.
should be balanced here. Ann Donahue, from Northfield and also Representative Berlin.
Hi, good morning. Dan Noyes. I represent Wolcott, Hyde Park, Johnson, and Belvedere.
Hi, good morning. Eric McGuire, Rutland City.
Brenda Steady, East Milton, Westford.
John Bishop, Colchester. Morning, Todd Nielsen, Brandon, Forest.
Morning, Zahn Eastus, Guilford and Vermont. Vernon.
That's right, Mom. We all
A constituent asked me to do that, no.
And I'm Esme from Hartford.
Jubilee, I am from Bridport and I also represent Middlebury, New Haven, Bridge.
Nice to see you, Ray Garofano, Essex and Essex Junction.
Lori, what's the committee assistant?
Yes, I
I'm Mary Beth Barrett from Violent Trade Action.
I'm Leanna Murray and I am on the board of directors for CSAC, which is counseling service as well as County.
Jim Morrison. I like his on several boards with her. Brian Plant with Bristol. I represent Addison Housing Works, Council Services, Madison County. I'm also on the board for the Vermont State Housing Authority. And I got 2 or 3 other committees.
Ethan Park of Montpelier, and I'm a universal healthcare advocate.
Nice.
We're just introducing ourselves.
Matt Levin, Executive Director of the Vermont Early Childhood Advocacy Alliance.
Thank you. And welcome to our witness. And members, you do have a copy of this on your website, and it's also up on the screen. So thank you for coming and sharing with us. It might be helpful, and you may be doing this. I haven't looked at your presentation yet, but give us a little overview of what Public Assets Institute is, and then we're very happy to have you. Thank you.
I'm very happy to be here. Thank you. I am Julie Lowell. I am the Economic Security Policy and Outreach Director at Public Assets Institute. And so for those of you who don't know public assets, we work on state fiscal policy with really the goal to improve the well-being of all Vermonters and to advance racial and economic equity. And we do this work with a lot of research and a lot of charts. So I brought a lot of charts for you today. I am going to try not to overwhelm you, but I want you to know where the data is as you're making really important decisions for the state, and that think of us as a resource as you're thinking about some of those data points. So before I jump into the research I want to share today, I want to, which looks at Vermont's economy and how Vermonters are doing, I just want to really ground the conversation in state statute. We know there is a lot happening federally right now. And so I think it's more important than ever to really understand what the stated purpose of our current system in Vermont is, where it does well in supporting people, because we're doing some great things and important things, and where we could use some improvement. So in 2012, Vermont passed the People's Budget language. And for those of you not familiar, it called for Vermont's state revenue and spending policies to address, and there's a list here: health, housing, dignified work, education, food, social security, and a healthy environment. So some pretty important goals right there. And as we're going to see from the data I'm going to share, much of what comes from a State of Working Vermont report, which we released at the beginning of the month. We're doing better in some of these areas than others. But we know that through the right policies and state investments, if we provide the right cash assistance, strong public goods, support for welfare asset building, and an equitable economy, we can take really concrete steps to bring us closer to the state's promises. to ensure that everyone in Vermont has economic security in a way that allows everybody in the state to make ends meet and then some. So for people to be able to make ends meet, their incomes need to meet their expenses. And we have found that far too many Vermonters are falling short of this goal right now. So every 2 years, the Joint Fiscal Office puts out their basic needs and livable wage report. It just came out a couple weeks ago. I did a little sleuthing. It looks like you haven't yet heard from the Joint Fiscal Office on this report. I'm not going to scoop them too much. But I want to point out, so this report, it looks at some different family types in Vermont, and it gives a baseline of what those families need to earn to make ends meet in the state. The amount that they call basic needs is much higher than the federally established poverty thresholds. In some cases, it's about 3 times as high. And so just to give you a sense, this is the basic needs line for a family of 4 with 1 earner. And so you can really see that there's a big gap between our wage policy, which establishes our minimum wage standard, which just went up to $14.01 per hour in the start of January, versus what a family of 4 with 1 earner needs to make ends meet. So we haven't had a chance yet at Public Assets to use the new numbers to evaluate how many Vermonters are really meeting the benchmark, and also some of the data we need hasn't been released. But last year, we looked at what share of Vermont families couldn't afford their basic needs, marrying census data with these basic needs thresholds presented by JFO. And so what we found in 2023 was that more than half of single adults, so those 3 bars on the right, whether they had kids or did not, were struggling to make ends meet. And even many of these 2-earner households were falling short. So this is both a wage problem and a cost problem. And I'm going to dive into both of those for you today. Historically, Vermont's wages have been much lower than the national average and comparative to other New England states, while our prices are generally average. And so you can see that on this chart here. Our prices are almost up to the US average, but our wages are much depressed. And the wage lag is driven by 2 things. First, wages for many jobs in Vermont are lower for the same job in other states. And second, we know that there are very high paid workers in just a handful of states that are actually pulling up that national average. And so actually most states do fall below this wage threshold. But in the states where the gap between prices and wages is actually smaller than we see in Vermont. So even as wages continue to be too low for many to cover costs, I want to point out that wages are growing. And we know that over the past 20 years, they've grown the fastest for those at the bottom. And also, we can see that median income in Vermont continues to grow. In fact, from 2019 to 2023, we had the highest growth rate. We at 7.8% of any state in New England, and I believe it was any state in the country. But you can still see here our median income is lagging. And so the difference here is that median income includes wages, but it also includes other incomes, that whether that's from dividends from the stock market or Social Security benefits or other things. That's what you're seeing in this chart. But again, even with this growth, we can see that our minimum wage policy continues to leave us short. So once one of the highest wages in New England, our minimum wage has now lost ground, and it continues to pull away from Vermont's livable wage as established by JFO. So Vermont's minimum wage was nearly $5 lower in 2024 than what the livable wage is. And that's specifically, I already named it, Joint Fiscal Office has a number of different family types. The livable wage in this is specifically defined as the wage a single person in shared housing needs to earn working full-time to make ends meet. So that's where that nearly $19 an hour comes from. So with, yeah.
I want to make sure I'm reading this chart correctly. So are you saying that Vermont's minimum wage is lower than Rhode Island, Maine, Massachusetts, and Connecticut?
Yes. Yeah, so those are all the minimum wages, and then the blue line is our livable wage based on JFO's calculations. Yeah, thank you. And so with the new increase to $14.01 in January with our minimum wage, which is our new minimum wage level, over the course of a year, that leaves that worker in shared housing about $10,000 short from covering their basic needs. So that's kind of the wage side. I want to dive into prices a little bit. And so you can really see kind of what's happening. And what we know is healthcare, housing, and food continue to drive increased prices in Vermont. Housing is the #1 household expense.
Can I ask you, just before you move on to prices, are those just earned wages?
The minimum wage?
That minimum wage, not the minimum wage chart, but I mean, overall in your wage information.
This one here?
Yeah, does it?
These are just wages.
Okay, so not, like investment income,
No.
not public benefits, just,
No, this is just the wages, but then the income chart would include those other pieces that you.
Okay.
talked about. Yeah,
okay, thank you.
yeah. So household, healthcare, housing and food, those are kind of our biggest cost drivers right now in terms of in affordability. And housing tends to be the number one household expense, and food, when you look at the family types JFO outlines, food is usually the second or third expense, depending on the family size. So the good news about health insurance is over 95% of Vermonters have health coverage. We're about fifth among the states. 42% or so in Vermont have public coverage, and another 42% have coverage through their employer, with the rest of Vermonters having other private coverage or a mix of private and public together, which is very common, or not very common, but does happen. Especially as you think of older Vermonters who might have public Medicare and then supplement with a private plan. But medical costs in 2024 specifically really jumped. And so what you can see up here in this little thumbnail is the inflation costs of medical care. And you can see it in comparison to inflation overall. And so these are the 12-month changes in prices. So in October of 2024, medical care costs jumped by over 6%, while overall inflation was closer to 3%.
Not just our imagination.
Not just our imagination. And again, based on JFO's report, what we saw, this part here is specifically out-of-pocket costs for people who have employers insurance. But you can see that it's nearly doubled for many Vermonters over this 20-year period. So we're really seeing quite an increase in the cost of care. Housing costs are also continuing to grow and become out of reach for more Vermont families. And again, what I also should have said before, I showed you a number of these charts that show the inflationary changes. We can't get this at the Vermont level, but these are the New England inflation metrics. So at least they're somewhat regional. And what we saw is that both rents and homeownership costs in New England have increased more quickly than inflation over the past 4 years, really focusing on the last 2 to 3 specifically.
And we can't do Vermont because the data
Not available.
not available. So nobody's tracking it, or?
I don't think they track it at this lower level. That's a good question, though. I can get back to you on that. But
Yeah, I mean, I just because the Department of Housing and Community Development sort of quotes some various things. I guess I don't know where that information comes from, but
I do have some specific Vermont numbers on housing, but the inflation numbers are only available at the New England level. Yeah. Mm-hmm. So for renters specifically, we saw a really big jump in the median rental cost. So this is the rent for that like middle unit, right? Half the units are higher, half the units are more expensive than this cost. This is even after adjusting for inflation. We saw a big jump during the pandemic that destabilized a number of families. The rent increases had slowed by 2023, but still more households are cost burdened compared to pre-pandemic, as the mix of units below the median level has changed. So you can't see that in the chart, but that distribution of the lower income units, we're starting to lose some of those units. And so we know there aren't enough affordable housing units in Vermont, both from the distribution of units and also from the experience of Vermonters. And so what I'm going to show you in this next chart is kind of the personal experience of renting in this market. So over 50% of households with incomes under $75,000 pay more than 30% of their household income on housing. And so that's kind of the generally accepted affordability metric. Those paying more than 30% are cost burdened. For renters with incomes under $75,000, this was closer to 2/3 of all renters in Vermont. So in total, 74,000 Vermont households with low or median incomes in the state were paying more than they could afford for housing. So as these costs continue to be out of reach, it's not a surprise that we have seen more and more Vermonters experiencing homelessness. Each year, the state does a one-day point in time count to get a sense, kind of a baseline measure of how the state's doing. And we saw last year nearly 35 people in Vermont lacked permanent housing, 3 times as many compared to before the pandemic in 2019, and representing the 4th highest rate of homelessness in the US. For those of you who are paying attention, they just did the point in time count. I believe it was last week. Those numbers won't be in for a while. So that's why if some of these
technically, we're all still entering data right now as someone who participates in that.
Yes. So it takes a little while. And it's, when some of these data points do feel dated, that is because of a data lag of when we can get some of these, the most recent data.
Julie, is it accurate to say, so I'm looking back at, when you were talking about the rate, the one with the pink line, bar graph, a couple before that, took that big jump in 2021. And it seems like the story that is unfolding here is that jump also in the adjustment in the mix of available housing is contributing to the rise in homelessness in Vermont.
I think that's pretty accurate to make that connection. Absolutely. Yeah. Yeah. With fewer affordable units, it's harder to get in. Yeah. So I'm going to move on to home ownership. For those who are interested in entering that market, the costs continue to be more prohibitive for families. So a lot of this data pulls from the Vermont Housing Finance Agency report, the basic needs or the housing needs assessment report that came out a few months back, which reported that Vermont median home prices rose by $55,000 in just 2 years. So a median home in 2021 was about $260,000. In 2023, that had jumped to $315,000. When you pair that with the rising interest rates on mortgages, so in 2021, mortgage rates were under 3%, and they were just under 6.5% in 2023. The cost of getting into a median priced home is now over $11,000 more expensive in that first year of home ownership. And due to much of this, as you can see, is due to those higher interest rates, right? That orange bar at the bottom. So due to the higher interest rates, people aren't only having to pay more for their housing year over year and the increased costs, but they're also not building that financial equity in their homes. And so they're strapped. So at the end of this, for the family in 2023, in the median home price, at the end of that first year, they have $1,800 less in equity for a more expensive home compared to the family in 2021. So people are, they're getting upside down more quickly. So not a surprise, I think you've heard a lot of this, like largely driving the increased prices in the market is a lack of supply and targeted supply. So this next chart also pulls from the housing needs assessment. And what we did at Public Assets was we took the assessment numbers and we visualized them in this way so that you can see how many units Vermont has brought online over the 5-year stretch from 2019 to 23. What the unmet demand was over that time. So that is the unmet demand to normalize vacancy rates, address homelessness, and replace destroyed homes. And then what the projected new demand is in the next 5 years. And so there's a kind of a low projection and a high projection. And in that high end, if you count all the new demand plus the unmet demand, it's up to around 36,000 units that they're saying the state needs in the next 5 years. So last, I'm going to talk in terms of prices, I'm going to talk about food. And so as you can see really starkly here, our food costs really started to become a challenge in October or in 2022. So over that 12-year stretch from October 21 to 22, we saw food costs increase by over 9%. The good news is that those food costs are not growing at that rate anymore. But I want to just really point out this is that food costs are not growing at that rate anymore. It doesn't mean the prices have come down. And so people are continuing to face those higher prices that were established a couple of years back. During the pandemic, we saw an increase in SNAP benefits in 3 Squares, Vermont. And so we actually saw people who were continually financially insecure actually maybe having a little bit of levity because of these increased investments and increased federal investments. But since then, the 66,000 Vermonters, almost 10% of Vermont families rely on 3 Squares, Vermont. They're now trying to get by each month on an average of $160 per month per person to be spent on food. So we know, sort of, I think all of us kind of know personally, that's just so despite all the sobering statistics, I'm going to move us into sort of what we know about people. And we know that targeted government investment can provide adequate support. So starting during the pandemic, we saw that government investment, including the federal expanded child tax credit, and then newly enacted state child tax credits, including Vermont's, which was enacted in 2022, really made inroads in helping families. And in this chart in particular, helping families with children. And so there's kind of two different measures that we can look at to see the impact of state investment, or two comparisons. So the dark orange line on this chart shows the official poverty rate. And this is just sort of what people have in income compared to an established threshold, which is honestly too low, but it is the measure that exists. The light orange line, it takes into account government investment. So it includes things like the child tax credit, the earned income tax credit, 3 Squares Vermont benefits. And what you can see is in this time period of, so taking the number of children in poverty in 2021, 22, and 23, we actually had 3,000 fewer children living in poverty because of government investment. So in addition to Vermont's child tax credit, which again, we started in 2022, it provides $1,000 per child under 6 to Vermont families. And that's for families up to $125,000 of household income get that benefit. We also have a really important state earned income tax credit, which is a little harder to talk about. As you can see, it's not quite as direct as $1,000 per kid under 6. But this, at the end of the day, it follows the federal earned income tax credit. Vermont pays 38% of the federal EITC for families. And it changes based on one's wages and the number of children in the households. And so this might be a little misleading because I just realized it says income here on the bottom, but this is actually based on your wages, how much your EITC benefit is. So if you have reach up income, you don't qualify for the earned income tax credit. So this is specifically kind of a workers' tax credit that provides assistance to families. And the key with both of these programs is their refundability. So that any tax credit that a family doesn't use to decrease their tax bill is actually paid back to them in cash, allowing families the flexibility to meet their differing needs, whatever that is, if it's a car repair, if it's student debt, whatever those things might be. And these credits are really inclusive. Everyone who qualifies for them based on their income levels and number of children, they receive them. And this includes all Vermont residents. So anyone who's lived in the state for 6 months and a day qualifies for these credits, which is one of the most inclusive in the US. So overall, nearly 20,000 Vermont families received the CTC in 2024, and over 32,000 families received the state EITC. So Reach Up is another really important program I think you've all been doing a lot of work on in the last couple of weeks, so I won't try to belabor this too much, but it provides really important cashless assistance to families with low income. The basic needs budget here is not the same one I've been talking about, but this is the basic needs kind of subsistence budget that the Department of Children and Families calculates each year, and then provides, as you know, 49.6% of this overall needs line currently based on the 2019 needs line. So what you can see is that the maximum benefit, this is for a family of 4, is $976. It has not changed in the last 4 years, despite all the inflationary challenges that I just talked about. Now the Reach Up benefit covers just 40% of what a family needed based on 2023 numbers. So we're falling behind here. Childcare, though, has been a bright spot. So I'll talk about some childcare bright spots. In 2023, we committed over $100 million annually to expand access to childcare and improve the system for both providers and families. We increased the amount of subsidies and the number of families eligible for them. The Vermont's Child Care Financial Assistance Program, it now reimburses the childcare programs to finally meet, and families to finally meet the federal target guidelines. So you can see that red line before we weren't up in 2019, we weren't meeting the federal target guideline. We finally made it there, which is great. There are still, there's still work to be done to shore up the system. There was pandemic issues. We lost slots during that time period. Enrollment went down. But this new investment is really having real impacts on families, children, and providers. And in fact, these new state investments in the new Joint Fiscal Office Basic Needs Budget report, it actually for the first time shows the basic needs budget going down for some of the family types with children, which is just really exciting, right? That we can make government an investment and make life more affordable. It's very encouraging. So when you look at all these programs comprehensively in the Vermont state budget, with the exception of tax credits, because those are an expenditure, so they're not reflected in the budget. They total about 10% of overall state spending. So those two orange slices in here. And so, so those are the individual well-being supports and housing. So with some real targeted investments, the state really can do more to help Vermonters immediately afford their basic needs. And as we think about these investments, we want to consider a new approach. With some public investments, as you all know, we go all in, right? Everyone can use our public parks, our roads, our education services. There's no questions asked, but we have had a different approach to some of the other promises. We have a piecemeal benefit system that doesn't guarantee everyone has access to public resources. We provide some emergency housing resources in the state, but only to the point where we've allocated resources. Reach Up assistance gets decreased based on the amount of appropriations that are directed to the program each year, and it doesn't meet its statutory goal of improving the well-being of children by providing for their immediate basic needs. So our current funding practices, we know they're not meeting all of our obligations, that they're making life unaffordable and if not impossible for so many Vermonters. But we do have the resources and can decide to approach our budget differently in the state, raising the revenue we need to meet these obligations. So while more than half of single adults in Vermont can't afford to meet their basic needs, we can see in this next chart that the wealthiest Vermonters have over $1 million on average left over after covering their basic needs, and that's on average. Vermont has a mostly progressive revenue system in which our system doesn't worsen inequality, but you can see that some key changes here could create a fully progressive system. And so this is our total taxes overall. So this.
Can I make sure you have, the previous chart was, that's what people had left over after meeting their basic needs.
So this chart here kind of looks at the revenue system in terms of, and this combines our income tax system, our education tax system, and our sales tax, and it shows in totality if our system is entirely progressive. And you can see we have some work to do still at the high end, right? We have it's a little more of a parabola than we would like it. We'd really just like it to be a straight line there. Targeted tax increases on those with the highest incomes can provide more resources for state investment to ensure Vermont lives up to the promises we've made in statute: quality healthcare, housing, dignified work, education, food, social security, healthy environment. So I covered a ton. All of these stand alone in like in our State of Working Vermont report. There's a few charts I didn't touch on: demographics, migration, some labor force charts, but these are really easy to kind of just, if you're interested in just looking at poverty, there's a one-page chart and a kind of description of what's going on there. So it's always a good reference, but I'm also happy to talk more in depth with you now or later about any of these data points. Thank you so much.
Questions? Lot of data to.
I gave you a lot.
And then Rep. Easties.
No, I just wanted to point out that in this report, in the full report, that you do talk about poverty of older Vermonters and how Vermonters over 65 saw a jump in poverty with nearly 6,000 falling below the poverty level in the last year.
Yeah,
Or no, since
I brought the
2019.
chart. I hit it, but I did bring it.
I just,
As I say, we care about older Vermonters here, not.
sorry,
Yeah.
I had seen this report and
Yeah.
just wanted to point that out.
I think this is striking. We know this is happening nationally. Don't fully know what's driving this, but know that this is happening nationally. And I'm happy to look further into it too, to try to.
I mean, it feels like healthcare expenses are going to be a driver in this area. I mean, and we also know that the rate of homelessness among older Vermonters is increasing. So their ability to afford housing that maybe they have been in because of that spike that happened in 2021 that has continued. It's, so I mean, I think there are some inflation with regard to food and things like that. Frankly, we don't do as much in terms of supports and services for older Vermonters that we do for children and families. And even though that's maybe not sufficient in some cases, like when we look at the reach up and rateable reduction and stuff like that. It's superior to what we do for older Vermonters, frankly. So I mean, I think, thank you for bringing it up. I
Yeah,
mean, because
and
I
I'm
think,
sure that contributes to this.
yeah, I mean, there's,
And this is the poverty, like this is the official poverty rate, but when you look at the supplemental, you see that this is one group that actually has higher level of poverty when you, because the supplemental poverty rate generally is just, it's a more in-depth calculation.
what
And
goes into the supplement? I used to know
Yeah.
this, and I can't pull it up.
I have a great chart I can share with you that is always my cheat sheet, right? But it has a slightly different baseline of what a household needs to make ends meet. And then it includes not just income, but it includes tax credits and SNAP benefits and have to double, it wouldn't, I think both should include Social Security. But one of the big reasons named in this national poverty report is that specifically that it's the medical costs that people are encountering that are continuing. And I think medical costs are calculated differently in the threshold. And so the threshold is a little bit more accurate for people's budgets.
Could you send us that with the supplemental?
Yes, it's a long report. I'll point you exactly to the page. Yeah.
Yes, Nick?
Thank you, Julia. I'm wondering if you could highlight for the committee some of the greatest barriers you found when it comes to reforming policy to better, more appropriately tax people at a rate which is, falls into the appropriate income level. So we're seeing that curve that you talked about versus, the fact that those folks making 50,000 are having the same burden as those in the top 1%.
So I think there's two thoughts as I hear that question. I think the first is really kind of a systemic challenge of how we approach budgeting in the building. Like we often have this managed from the money approach of this is how much we bring into the system. That's all we can do. We can't do anymore. We heard it yesterday about in the budget address that, we had, I think, was it $250 million of kind of new revenues, but we had $500 million of asks. But what are those asks? They're really real needs for Vermonters. And so I think we could approach our budgeting differently and say, what do we actually need to make sure that everybody is safe, is secure, has their basic needs met, and how do we get there as a state? So I think in one way, it's a philosophy of how we approach it. I think another kind of more specific area is that, go back to this, now you're seeing all my hidden work. I forgot to bring the three other charts that make up this chart. And so what you can see with this chart is that as we all know, sales tax tends to be regressive, right? It's a fixed amount. People on the lowest end are paying the highest percentage of their income on sales tax. So that chart looks like this. We have a really good progressive income tax system. So that chart looks like this, right? The higher income you have, the more you're paying on taxes. But our education tax system is where this shape exists in a more extreme way. And again, I can share that chart. But what happens is in our current mixed system where some people pay on income and some on property taxes, the highest income Vermonters pay on their property and wind up paying a lower percentage of their income towards property taxes, and which is why we have somewhat regressive system on the high end.
And maybe just to follow up, so this argument, obviously, it makes a lot of sense to me coming from a personal perspective, but I'm curious about some of the responses that you get in arguing against that. And I know that's, these aren't your words, but things that you're hearing generally speaking against that argument as to, that strategy for reforming our education funding system, for example.
Yeah, that's a great question. So I think what you're saying is moving from a mixed system to one that's all based on income? Or
arguments, against that, I think that you're hearing mostly. And I
think there's a great question. I feel like I'm not prepped to answer.
That's okay.
No, it's really important. I mean, what I would say is that we do have a proposal to offer some solutions in the middle of that tax challenge for people, for those in the middle who are currently feeling a lot of stress from their education taxes, because we are hitting kind of some cliffs in that scheme or in that structure and system. But what I think I should do is connect you to Steph Yu, who is our education funding expert, and get her in touch with you. Yeah, I don't want to misspeak.
I would encourage people to go to the Public Assets Institute website. There's a lot of information on the website, and they have other reports and publications that are helpful to us in sort of understanding the complexity of Vermont. So I actually appreciate all the research that you folks do in order to provide us with actually some data on which to make decisions, which is good. Apropos of our previous witnesses, or not witnesses, but topic where we were lacking data on which to make decisions, but we made them anyway. So I think it's important to understand that, for instance, like you pointed to the on the childcare, how that made a difference in the poverty level of families and some of our tax credits and things like that. So it's helpful information. And I have taken a look at some of the education stuff, which is also actually really, really helpful. So
Yes, please do be in touch with questions. And if we don't know the answer, we'll try to find it. That's what we do. We're researchers.
Representative Donahue.
So I have an information input bias. There is a chart that was done once upon a time and it's never been updated since. I didn't realize it was that long ago, 2016, that I've always found the most helpful kind of one sheet chart that sort of gives this overall picture. The 2016 one is obviously skewed by all sorts of changes since then, but it was designed really to show the cliff in terms of supports.
Is that Brian's chart or is it one of our charts?
It's not one of your charts. I was wondering if you ever had one like it or looked to doing something like it.
I'm looking over and sure it looks like one of Deb Brighton's charts.
Yes, Deb Brighton, joint
Yeah.
fiscal, yeah.
remember that one.
Earnings and net resources to meet basic needs. And it, single parent, 2 children is one I have, but it shows each of the compilation of different supports and how despite that, even if you include everything, it doesn't reach basic needs, but then it, there's like a $10,000 earning increase range at which you continue to lose money for your family. Before you come even again. And again, it's an old chart. I'm sure that the big picture isn't really different, but it would be more accurate if there was something updated that.
You can just teed me up. Well, we are, I can sort of reference this in my testimony, but we're planning to do a basic needs budget report that looks at the basic needs budget of JFO and ties it to the actual census data of what people are experiencing. And we're trying to figure out if this is an element we can update or not in the report. This is something, the most recent chart of that, to my best knowledge, is the 2018 tax commission report. I think Deb updated it.
They did an update for that. Okay.
I talked with her, we talked about the methodology. It is a labor of love. And it's a really important chart. And I have often wondered in my pie in the sky dreaming days, could this be part of the basic needs budget? Could we also have them include this in the basic needs budget? It's a complicated analysis to include all the different benefits and income levels. And, because of course, none of our benefits use the same qualifications, right? They're all slightly different.
Yeah.
So I'm going to chew on that. I'm not promising anything, but this is definitely something that's been on my mind because you're absolutely right. That chart is incredibly helpful.
It's incredible. And one of the reasons it's so helpful is because people will say legitimately, if you don't have the data, well, you're doing that based on what people get from reach outs, but they're getting all these other benefits. You're not counting them. If you actually do count them, you see that it's still short of essential living, but you can't respond to that if you don't have the data to respond to.
Yeah, I think it really gives a nice informed picture too of where can we target and what are really the investments rather than this sort of large.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. It also honestly helps to make policy choices about where, if we have limited resources, where we would invest those resources in the sort of stack of different things, right? Anyways, so we're given our, yay, we'd love to see that.
It's a ton of work.
Yeah.
Which we're not afraid of, but it takes
any
make no promises, yeah, but I am aware that chart is.
I'd like to understanding this way outdated, but if people want visually to know what I'm talking about, I'll send a copy of this.
Yeah, good idea.
It's old, but you know, it's
Gives you a
gives you a
sense of what we're
picture
talking about.
of, yeah.
Yeah. Great. Any other questions? Well, we don't ordinarily take questions from the side, but I'll make an exception in this case. So go ahead.
I think that each month I struggle. My food stamps are only $87 a month. That does not go very well. And then trying to get the extras, I don't have the income to be able to do that. I'm gonna be honest here. After I do my bills at the beginning of each month, if I have $40 left for the month, I'll look.
Thank you for sharing that.
My housing, thank goodness. I have through the Vermont housing, so it goes with 30% of my income. But if it wasn't for that, my rent would be almost $1,000 a month for where I live. I would be back in the homeless shelter. I was in the homeless shelter back in 2006. I think that was the lowest point of my life. I was terrified because it was something that I was not familiar with when I was younger. My dad had a good job. I never had to worry about having food on the table. Now, it's just like, okay, where's my next meal coming from? I am so grateful for Hope and CBOEO, which are the food shelters in my area, but I struggle every single day, wondering, how am I gonna get through? Thank goodness I don't have kids. And then without Medicaid, I don't follow. I'm over the threshold. So it's that just adds the added stressor. CSAC has been so helpful to me. 2 years ago, I wouldn't have been able to talk to you. They have done such amazing work, and granted, it's been between my counselor and I've done the hard work myself, but it's still very scary. I don't know the unhoused right now. I don't know how they're doing it. I really don't. Most of them don't work. And I think that with the unhoused right now, it adds to the mental health community because of that added stress.
Thank you, Marie.
Thank you. Thank you so much for sharing. We appreciate that.
Yeah, and I think it really gives a voice to like, what is just the numbers.
We've just been looking at in the charts, exactly. Thank you. Thank you. Okay, folks, thank you so much, Julie, for being here. That's
Thanks for doing this work. Good luck. Guys are gonna do great.
well, thanks.
That one's easy. I'll work on that one.
Okay, okay, folks. Okay, folks, just for a second. That's okay. So just, we're gonna wrap up for lunch now. And just a reminder, we have testimony coming back for Mental Health Advocacy Day.